Hi everyone, thanks for listening in. Today I'm going to talk about perfectionism, people pleasing, and high functioning anxiety, and how they all tend to work together. Um, I generally am not very good at having a linear conversation. Um, as an INFJ personality, hello anybody else out there who's an INFJ, I tend to think circularly or sort of in a spiral, and I will eventually get back to my point if I go on a tangent, but I did bring these note cards just to keep myself on track so I don't just talk for hours and hours. Um, so I have my own personal experience with perfectionism. It has been the way that I've coped for most of my life, and I have been recovering from it for a good many years now. I would say about 12 or 13 years, actively recovering. And so I wanted to share my own insights and my own process. Um, I kind of broke it down into sections. So, number one, what is perfectionism? Um, Two, what causes perfectionism? Three, what are the characteristics of perfectionism? My own stories and examples of those characteristics, and what are ways that we can overcome. Uh, because it can be very so. As a child, um, it makes sense and is logical to your brain and your body to develop these mechanisms as a strategy to survive whatever situation. It doesn't have to be severe trauma. It can be something, I mean, we all go through some kind of trauma at different levels. And we, thankfully, our brains are very smart, very wise, and find ways to cope with the trauma in the moment. And if there isn't some kind of way to process or move through um, in the moment, then we can hold on to these ways of these strategies, these mechanisms. And then as an adult, it becomes very limiting and very debilitating because it can become very entrenched into the way that we see ourselves in the world and the ways in which we respond to circumstances and experiences. Um, so, on the one hand, it's a positive thing because it's necessary, in these circumstances. And then as you get older, these behaviors, these strategies can become a form of limitation and can really hold you back in your life. So that's been my experience in terms of how it presented for me. And you can feel as though you are not living your authentic self. You're not. This is where the people pleasing comes in. You're thinking more about other people. You're hyper vigilant around other people and wanting to make sure they're okay. And so then, in a sense, you're denying yourself, sacrificing yourself, and it leads to a feeling of disconnection from yourself and a feeling of not being able to be authentic. So already I'm going on a tangent. So anyway, I was researching because I'm studying, I'm a student of psychology, and I kind of wanted to just get a sense of what was out there around perfectionism in terms of, the definitions and on a more sort of scientific psychological perspective. And in my research, I'm going to look at my phone because I marked these different pages. But some of you might know Brene Brown. She was known for her TED Talk on vulnerability. It's very popular. But in or on the site goodtherapy.org, they quote her. They say, Brene Brown, a writer and research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, distinguishes between perfectionism and healthy behavior. She says perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is not about healthy achievement and growth. She explains that perfectionism is used by many people as a shield to protect against the pain of blame, judgment, or shame. And that really resonated with me because I think a lot of people have a tendency, they think of perfectionism, they think, oh, that person has a really strong work ethic. And it's true, like, as a perfectionist myself, I happen to also have a very strong work ethic, but it's actually not the same thing in my experience. In fact, it's kind of the opposite in that with perfectionism, it's like you almost avoid or hold yourself back from trying unless you know you're going to be good at it. So it paralyzes you from really being open to learning. And when you're open to learning, you can strive, you can work towards something. But if you are, have that perfectionist mindset, it really, there's a fear of actually ever looking bad or not being good enough. So then you hold yourself back unless you know you're going to be able to, be amazing. So that is a very limiting, it's a very limiting of being in the world. Another site, this was just from Wikipedia, but I didn't know the different types. They've categorized the different types of perfectionism, and one that I really resonated with is called the Perfectionism Social Disconnection Model. The Perfectionism Social Disconnection Model, PSDM, is a dynamic relational model describing perfectionism and its consequences in an interpersonal context. This model asserts that perfectionism via an interpersonal style characterized by aloofness and inauthenticity leads to the social disconnection and rejection perfectionists aim to avoid. I can totally relate to that because a big part of my experience as a perfectionist is the feeling of isolation, the feeling that you do not belong, because if you cannot be human, if you cannot, if you're not allowed to make mistakes, then there's this harsh criticism towards yourself, which then, translates to the way that you feel about other people. It's not that you actually feel above or better than. That's just a way to protect yourself. And so then there's a feeling that, that you can't be a part of the rest of the human community. It sets you apart because if you're having this over critical dialogue about yourself, that tends to be projected on other people, and that keeps you separate. So to continue, according to PSDM, perfectionism develops in an early interpersonal context through asynchrony between child and caregiver, when there is a lack of attunement or fit between the temperament of the child and caregiver responses, leading to unfulfilled needs for belonging, acceptance, and self-esteem. This creates a relational schema of others as critical and rejecting, and an internal model of oneself as defective, which makes perfectionists highly sensitive to the potential for judgment and rejection in interpersonal encounters. Consequently, according to the PSDM, perfectionism serves an interpersonal purpose, and the person relies on it as a means of fulfilling the needs for belonging and self-esteem. Oh my gosh, I don't know if you guys can hear me right now with the wind blowing. It's really loud. I might have to take this video to a different spot. Woo! I wanted to do it outside because my space is really small and I can feel claustrophobic being inside. Okay, in an attempt to gain a sense of acceptance and connection while avoiding possible judgment and rejection, these individuals aim to be or appear flawless, Paradoxically, this often rigid, aloof, and self-concealing relational style increases the potential for alienation and rejection and can lead to social disconnection. In this way, the very behaviors that perfectionists consider as purportedly fulfilling unmet relational needs exert a detrimental influence on interpersonal encounters. The PSDM also provides a link between perfectionism and its maladaptive consequences, since the estrangement from oneself and others generated by perfectionism is associated with a number of adverse outcomes, such as interpersonal difficulties, depression, and suicide risk. Now, that's just one model, and there are several models. This one in particular goes back to the attachment theory by the theorists John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, where if the caregiver, the parent, is not attuned with the child and is not meeting their needs, the child starts to feel that some part of them is not worthy or unlovable or bad. And of course, there's different levels of that. If there's abuse and trauma, that just that adds a whole other dimension to the coping strategy that one can develop. And again, it's not conscious. Everybody comes into the world with a certain innate personality and disposition, and there's the genetic factors, and then there's the environment. So everyone behaves differently. Everybody responds differently, and perfectionism is just one response. It's one, and for me, it fit. It matched my personality, and it was sort of the safest strategy for me in my environment, and so that became part of my identity, and sort of the work. So the work that I've been doing has been to sort of unravel, what is the mechanism and what is truly me. And so, okay, moving on, because I don't want to just go on these long tangents. It'll go on forever. I wrote down a list of the characteristics of perfectionism, and I kept thinking of more and more as I went along, so I'm not going to spend time on each one. If you're interested in learning more about the attachment theory, you can Google that, and it was one of, for me, when I studied it, it really made the most sense in terms of how children, how their needs are basically informed. If their needs are met or not met, basically shapes the way the child grows. And so it's at a very core, at a very root place. And I found it really, really interesting, and I felt like it really resonated with my own trauma experience, and my own experience of neglect, and not having my needs met, feeling like I was not enough, all of those things. So